Count Dracula will never die, because he lurks within all of us. He's all of those parts of our nature that we reject, and thus get repressed into our unconscious, forming an archetype that Carl Jung called the shadow. Here, I suggest that Dracula is the shadow of mild-mannered solicitor Jonathan Harker, who in turn represents the conscious personality, or ego. Harker's mind is a busy place, because every other major character in the novel could also be seen as part of his unconscious. Part 1. The Ego Meets the Shadow. When the novel begins, we are first introduced to the conscious mind, Jonathan Harker. At this time, Harker is a newly qualified solicitor whose ambitions are worldly in nature and limited to his career and his relationships. However, the ego is far from being the whole mind, with the true self comprised of both our consciousness and the older, darker, unconscious mind. Jonathan Harker takes a long journey from the world of the ordered and predictable conscious mind, represented by Victorian England, to the wild, chaotic, confusing lands of the unconscious, or Transylvania. Perhaps this represents Harker's initial step on the journey to confront and integrate elements of the unconscious into the conscious mind, a process which Jung called individuation. The fine, upstanding Jonathan Harker has hidden his darker impulses, and these impulses must be dark indeed to have manifested as the vampire Count Dracula. In the wild of the Transylvanian unconscious, Dracula is all-powerful, and the conscious mind completely at its mercy. The Count exhibits various qualities that symbolize his association with the unconscious. Number 1. Dracula is a creature of the night, much like the unconscious, which directs our dreams while the conscious mind sleeps. Number 2. The instinctual and primal unconscious is also far older than the conscious ego, and the undead and unconscious Dracula has lived, or at least undied, for centuries, while the ego, Harker, is resolutely 19th century up to date with a vengeance. Number 3. Dracula's ties to the unconscious are reflected in his control over certain animals, and his ability to assume their form, as animals are presumed to be ruled largely or wholly by unconscious instinct, rather than ego. Number 4. Much like his influence over animals, Dracula also controls those in a less conscious state, like Renfield in his spells of lunacy, and Lucy when she sleepwalks. Number 5. Infants are also more unconscious than conscious, and Dracula is very infantile in some ways. He is obsessed with and feeds off women, much like a hungry baby, and he sleeps in an enclosed, womb-like box. He is also completely selfish, caring for nothing but for his own survival and his own needs. And, like a baby, is a tyrant who doesn't cooperate with other people. Van Helsing frequently refers to Dracula's child brain in the novel, suggesting that the latter has a reduced level of consciousness. Number 6. Water represents the unconscious, and thus perhaps it is appropriate that Dracula arrives in England during a terrible storm. While the unconscious is a nebulous creature of water or air, the conscious is solidly rooted in the earth. Mina writes that, "Somehow I felt glad that Jonathan was not on the sea last night, but on land. But oh, is he on land or sea? At this point in the novel, the ego, Harker, is trapped in the Transylvanian unconscious, while the shadow has made landfall in the conscious, confusing the two states. Lucy also suggests that being under Dracula's spell is like being immersed in water. Part 2. The Priest, the Warrior, and the King. Dracula, as the Shadow, is all of those qualities of Harker that the latter won't admit about himself. This doesn't mean that the Shadow is purely negative. For example, if we have low self-worth, we may bury positive attributes that we feel we can't relate to. Dracula, while a demonic figure, also has elements of 3 heroic archetypes: the priest, the warrior, and the king. That is, a man of ideas, a man of action, and a man of control, vision, and leadership. Van Helsing describes the Count as soldier, statesman, and alchemist, consistent with his potential as a soldier or warrior. Van Helsing notes that this vampire which is amongst us is of himself so strong in person as 20 men. As a priest, Van Helsing notes that he is of cunning more than mortal, for his cunning be the growth of ages. And finally, consistent with Dracula's association with the king, Van Helsing says, all the dead that he can come nigh to are for him at command. But ultimately, like the unconscious itself, Dracula is only potential. He is all, and yet nothing. Out of the unconscious mind must come the separate, differentiated archetypes, and while Dracula travels to England, these archetypes emerge as 3 men: John Seward, the psychiatrist, as the priest, Quincy P. Morris, the Texan outdoorsman, as the warrior, and Arthur Holmwood, the aristocrat, as the king. The first of these characters to appear in the novel is John Seward. Holmwood is mentioned by Lucy first, but he doesn't appear until later. This early appearance of Seward may reflect the predominance of the priest archetype in Jonathan's mind. As a studious solicitor, Harker certainly resembles the priest more than he resembles the other archetypes. Moreover, Harker meets Seward before he meets Morris and Holmwood. Indeed, his first meetings with the warrior and the king are not even mentioned in the novel. Perhaps even the apparent similarity in the first syllable of the otherwise unrelated names Jonathan and John is a clue to the affinity of Harker for the priest archetype. Seward is also the only one of the 3 to have a voice in the novel, with his phonograph diaries relaying much of the plot. Quiet introversion and thought will not be enough for Harker to defeat Dracula, and he must embrace some hitherto unrealized potential buried within his shadow. Part 3. The Wise Old Man, the Anima, the Mother, and the Trickster. At first, the 3 heroic archetypes all act behind Harker's back. He is not aware of the machinations of the unconscious. Harker is first introduced to their activities through a meeting with Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who represents the Wise Old Man archetype. The Wise Old Man, according to Jung, is an archetype within the collective unconscious that symbolizes meaning in the apparent chaos of life. At times when our conscious mind cannot see past its own prejudices and preconceived ideas, the far older unconscious can often see a solution, and can appear in dreams to offer advice. Van Helsing is as much of an enigma as Dracula. Like Dracula, he is also a mysterious, multi-talented foreigner. Physician, metaphysician, lawyer, polyglot, and clearly more of a symbolic archetype than the flesh and blood human being. Lucy is perhaps Harker's anima, a playful, elven, feminine part of his unconscious, which balances out the masculine ego. Men frequently project their own anima onto a woman who makes a big impression on them, and through that woman, the anima can drive that man towards the highest flights, or cause him to be dashed against the rocks. Lucy embodies the playful feminine energy of the anima and inspires the devotion of all three heroic archetypes, each of whom propose to her in turn. At first, she is a positive force, but upon falling under the influence of the shadow, she begins to drain the life of all three heroic archetypes and the wise old man through blood transfusions, and ultimately the corrupted and destructive anima has to be destroyed under the guidance of the wise old man. The brides of Dracula are also symbolic of the wily feminine anima with which Jonathan is obsessed, and with theirs and Lucy's destruction, the ego is freed from such dark flights of fancy to allow it to engage in a mature relationship with Mina. And so, onto the train fiend herself, Mina Harker, née Murray. Mina is very different to Lucy. She is level-headed, well-organised, and down-to-earth, making her a perfect companion to the priest. Rather than being a playful elven character, she is a maternal figure to Harker and the various elements of his unconscious. She herself notes that, "We women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters when the mother spirit is invoked." So it seems that Mina could perhaps represent the mother archetype, which, like the anima, can also be positive or negative, as either the compassionate, caring matron or the all-devouring, poisonous mother. While the anima Lucy and the brides are muse-like figures that can inspire or destroy men, the good mother is a nurturing and caring figure. Jonathan must rid himself of his anima obsession to be a good husband to Mina. Finally, Renfield is a mercurial figure, switching from deranged eater of insects to homicidal maniac, to a surprisingly erudite and articulate gentleman as the mood takes him. As the maniac, he shares Dracula's oral fixation, and generally has something of the shadow about him. But then, as the novel goes on, he becomes more and more the gentleman, resembling the ego, Jonathan. Perhaps he is a trickster figure, representing a gradual softening of the shadow into an increasingly civilized form that is acceptable to the ego. It is interesting to note that when Harker, Seward, Van Helsing, Homewood, and Morris all go to see Renfield, Renfield addresses all of them, except Harker. Perhaps Harker was not worthy of Renfield's attention, or perhaps Harker and Renfield are different aspects of the same person. Part 4. Integration. By the time Harker is introduced to the wise old man, the priest, the king, and the warrior, it is all but over for the shadow. It's not long before they found and destroyed all of his boxes but one, and Dracula, wearing his fancy straw hat to keep the sun off his face, is forced to flee back to the realm of the unconscious. Following Dracula's baptism of Mina, Harker moves away from the priest archetype and starts to become the warrior. He is the first to attack Dracula with his kukri knife when they encounter him at Piccadilly, and he vows to send Dracula to burning hell if he can. By the end of the novel, Jonathan Harker has become Rambo. He carries his knife everywhere, and he pursues the Count by train, by boat, and by horse. To show that Harker is finally integrating the warrior archetype into his conscious mind, it is he and Quincy Morris who fight towards the cart carrying Dracula, with Harker slitting the shadow's throat and Morris stabbing it in the heart. At this point, Harker has reconciled with the warrior-like aspects of the shadow. The death of both Morris, the warrior archetype, and Dracula, the shadow, perhaps represent their assimilation into Harker himself. Here, the text is just as important as the subtext. In my proposed interpretation, Harker musters all of the resources of his mind to integrate the shadow. But the story is of a band of companions with very different skills, who work together to defeat Dracula. As Van Helsing says, "But we are strong, each in our purpose, and we are all more strong together. And we have on our side power of combination, a power denied to the vampire kind." Understanding oneself is a necessary step towards being able to successfully cooperate, and Dracula shows us that even the ancient forces of evil are no match for close companions working together with a common purpose.